Okay, so now that sound you hear in the distance is the sound of the bell going off. That means the class has begun. Welcome to You, Me, and a CL3, a series of classes brought to you by the Production Academy and your host, Brian Maddox. That's me. Special thanks to the Production Academy for partnering with me on doing this. You'll see that we have, look, a CL3 console, so that's fancy. And, you know, we can look at the screens and stuff and see stuff. This week, I decided to just do a session on remote control and networking of the console. So what we're going to talk about is how to connect the editor to the console, how to connect StageMix, which is Yamaha's iPad app, to the console, and even, hopefully if we have a little bit of time, how to connect the console to another CL or QL console all the way across the country using a custom piece of software built by Andy Broughton, known as Remotely Possible. So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's dive right in. The first thing that I want to do is find my Pages document. Okay, the second thing I want to do is I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about networking in general. Now, I am not a network engineer. This is very much a very high level kind of overview, but what I'm hoping is that if we all understand these basic concepts, a lot of the pitfalls and, you know, holes we fall into when we're trying to connect these things up and it's not working. I remember when I first started using Yamaha consoles and trying to attach iPads and trying to attach computers and trying to do all this cool stuff, it was very difficult because I didn't understand the absolute basics of how networks work and the specifically how the IP addresses work and those kinds of things. So to start off with, all what we're going to be building, or what you're working for, is what's known as a local area network, a LAN. You'll see it, you know, used constantly, and it basically just means a network of devices that are all local to one location. They're not going over the internet. They're not. When it says local, and local might be, you know, 2 buildings over fiber, but it's still, you know, a local network. And what we're trying to do is get things to talk to each other without getting confused and sending messages to the wrong thing and hearing things from the wrong thing. So the way that I like to think of it is you have a bunch of houses, okay? And each house is unique, you know, just as every house is, you know, even if you have a whole street of houses that all were built the same and look the same, each one is a unique building. Some of them have leaky pipes, some of them don't have leaky pipes. And if you had 6 houses across the country and they wanted to be able to send packages back and forth to each other easily, even though each house is unique, and let's just say, for instance, that each house has its own name. So let's say that there's a house named Brian and a house named Scott and a house named Kellen and a house named, you get the idea. They each have an individual name. They're all unique. Every house in the entire country has a unique name. Well, if I wanted to send a package to Scott's house and I just put the label on and I said Scott's house, the red one with the cool roof that leaks in the basement a little bit, and then I gave that to the post office, they would be really, really annoyed with me, because how do I find that needle how do I find that one house out of all possible houses? Those names that I'm referring to right now in computer speak are called MAC addresses. And so each device, theoretically, there is some overlap, but that's another class. Each device on a local area network has a MAC address. That's its local. This is my identification. If I had 14 CL3s on a network, they would all have different MAC addresses. And that's great, but when I'm trying to find them in the sea of all possible MAC addresses, it gets very complicated. So that's where the idea of IP addressing comes in. It's the exact same concept as a physical address for a postal address. And it's basically assigning an address to a physical object. So just as my house, Brian's house, has the address of 2237 Armstrong Drive, Savannah, Georgia, come visit me anytime you want, And every house in the United States has a unique address because they're also in different cities, and they're in different states, and they're in different countries. And so those are the areas in the United States. Maybe in your country you have provinces or regions or neighborhoods or what or towns or whatever, but we all, we arrange these things by, a small piece that's part of a bigger piece that's part of a bigger piece that's part of a bigger piece. So I always promise that there's not going to be PowerPoint slides, but this is the closest that we'll ever get. Is I'm going to do kind of a notepad kind of thing with pages here, just so I can have a little bit of something to illustrate. So right here, what I've done is I've typed out a very common IP address, 192.168.1. I'm going to take the 1 off, and I'm going to make it 27. Okay. So in the United States, you could think of these 4 different numbers as the United States, the state of Georgia, the city of Savannah, Armstrong Drive is what each one of those chunks is representing. And it's really handy if we know ahead of time that rather than having 2 devices that are trying to send packages back and forth, or 3 that are trying to send packages back and forth, that they aren't having to look at every address in the United States. All right, let me back up for a second. So the key thing to remember is that if we have multiple devices that are trying to send packages to each other, which we call them packets in digital ease, but we're sending packets to each other. Each device needs to have its own address, or else nobody can find anything. If someone in California sends a package to Savannah, Georgia, but there's 2237 Armstrong drives, well, then there's no guarantee that it's going to go to the proper one. So every device needs to have its own IP address assigned to it, so that they can tell where the package is supposed to go to. But it's really handy if the post office already knows the basic area that it's going to be in. And that's where we get into the concept of subnet masks, which basically is just a really fancy way of saying everything. The only thing that needs to be different is these last 1 number or 2 numbers, and everything in front of that, they just all have to match. They all have to be the same. So, for instance, if I were to have a subnet mask of, I'm not even getting into binary and whatever, but basically these numbers go from 0 to 255 because binary. Google it, look it up. That's the range. Everything's from 0 to 255 because it works really well for binary stuff. So if I were to set a subnet mask, I'm going to write that down. So this is IP addresses, and it's kind of like that. And then I was to say subnet mask. If I set a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, basically what that's going to mean is, and again, I'm not going to dive deep into the reasons why and how this works or whatever, but what that basically is going to mean is that for all of my devices to be able to talk to each other, these first 3 numbers all need to be the same. They all have to, so all of the devices in my local area network need to begin with 192.168.1. something so that they then can differentiate from each other. You could theoretically open this up larger, and you could say that this was 0, and then as long as the first 2 numbers are the same, everything past that could be a different number. But every single time you open up a bigger area, a bigger address, every packet has to go through more of where am I supposed to go. These are all the different possible places I could go, and it just adds latency and confusion and, that much more like, oh, there's so many options. When I limit it down with a 255 so that it's just the last number, that gives me over 200 options. I can hook up 200 different devices in a local area network. It's technically 254 or 255. But well over 200 devices, which for most of us is more than enough. As far as why is it 255 and why is it 0, I don't really know. That's the answer. That's the truth. I'm just a sound guy. I know enough about this stuff to get the stuff connected and working. I'm not an IT guy. There's a reason why IT professionals go to school for years and years and years to learn really the nuts and bolts of this. But suffice to say, the two things that when you're trying to network these things together, that you really want to pay attention to is what IP address are the different devices on, and what is the subnet mask that's basically controlling how many of these first numbers need to be the same in order for the two things to be in the same neighborhood and be able to talk to one another. I mean, that's probably a better way of putting this is, when I have this subnet mask of 255, 255, 2550, I'm basically saying all of the devices that are going to talk to each other are all in Savannah. So there's nothing in Atlanta, there's nothing in Columbus. These are all different places in Georgia for those who aren't from this country. Everything is in the city of Savannah. And so I can send that to my post office and they know, cool, put this in a pile of stuff that stays in Savannah and we know it can just stay local and I don't need to worry about going any farther. If I needed a broader range of addresses because I needed to send something to Atlanta and Columbus and Bluffton and some other cities in Georgia, then I would actually take this out to a 0 so that now the only thing that has to be in common is the country of the United States and the state of Georgia, and the post office would send it to a bigger distribution center that sent trucks all over Georgia, but they wouldn't have to worry about putting it on a big giant truck that went across the country to some other state. So hopefully that analogy gives us some reference point. There's one last gotcha for networking, and then we'll actually start connecting up some console stuff, and then I'll actually go to questions. Let's see if I missed anything. If I'm going to use it. Yeah, okay. The way that these addresses are assigned is very important to understand. So one of the ways is a manual or static IP address. And basically that just means I look at the device and I say, this is going to be your address, and I make your address that address, and that's the address that it's going to be. The good thing about that is that it's always that address. You turn it off, you turn it back on, and that house always has that address, and that's great. The bad news is that I can just as easily go to a different device and give it the exact same IP address because I'm literally assigning it. So it's the same thing as if I put the number 5 on my house and then I put the number 5 on a house 2 houses up, and then the postman shows up and the letter carrier shows up and they're like, there's 2 houses with the same address and I don't know where to go. There are times when manual and static IPs are useful and we use them, but there are also times when they're not. The next solution is what they call DHCP, which stands for Don't Hardly Count People. I don't know what it stands for. I don't have to know. Dynamic something 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 people something. But the important thing to know is basically if you're using a DHCP assignment system, you've got a DHCP server somewhere on the network. And that's just a central box that's looking at all the devices that are on the network, and it is saying, these are the addresses you're going to have. And ahead of the time, you say, okay, DHCP server, I want you to stay in 192.168.12 25. And so then the DHCP server will then assign things between those numbers. You just say DHCP server, that's what I want you to do. Every time a device gets turned off and turns back on again, the DHCP server takes a look at it and goes, this is your address. And it makes sure that everybody is in the right range, but everybody gets a different address so everything can talk to each other. It does take longer when you first turn things on for an address to be assigned, but it's a really good way to do things. And typically most DHCP servers will remember, oh, that's Brian's house. I gave him, 111, so he's always going to be 111. So even though I go to sleep, when I wake up the next day, it'll just say, oh, that's Brian's house again. He gets 111. But DHCP servers are nearly always in the router that you bought at your house. It can be a dedicated device. It can be a lot of different things. As far as in an actual system, a lot of different things can act as a DHCP server. It's also possible to put more than one DHCP server by accident on the same LAN and tell them both to hand out addresses in the same ranges, and then they will fight over what address is what, and bad things will happen. So again, it's good to just understand the basic concept of a DHCP server and what it does. Last but not least, we have self-assigned, or what is sometimes called auto IP. And the idea behind this is actually really pretty simple. It's what if I tell my device I've got a DHCP server? So the device goes, cool, I don't have an address. I'm just going to wait till somebody gives me an address. But then I don't have a DHCP server. So the device is waiting for an address. There's nothing to give it an address, and so it sits there and it's being stupid. The concept of self-assigned IP or an auto IP is something built into the IP protocol that then says, after a certain amount of time, after you've waited a certain amount of time for an address and haven't gotten one, then you can assign your own. But there's a little bit of a limitation in there, so it's not complete anarchy crazy town, and that is that by default it needs to be in the range of 169.254 dot something dot something. And so if you see your device is in a 169.254 address range, you can bet that the device is set for DHCP or set for auto IP, but there isn't a server on there, and so it has self-assigned itself an address. This is where I get a little fuzzy, but I'm pretty sure it looks on the network and goes, here's all the addresses on the network. I'm going to make sure I pick one that's not here. But it's also between these two little, it's like 255 times 255. I invite somebody to do the math on that right now. But there's a lot of addresses available, is the point. So that's the real kind of mega basic like networking stuff that you kind of need to understand before you start putting consoles together and doing remote controls, because it's just it will help you when things don't immediately connect to understand, why is this not working, or why is this not joining together. Okay, I'm going to take a second and go, and Kellen is showing off and going, apparently it's dynamic host configuration protocol. I liked my version better. It's the address hander outer dude. That's what it is. It's the address hander outer dude. Jeff Francis says 65K, which means he's answering some question that I don't know what it is. There's some comments in there about Dante certification, and I'll reinforce that a little bit at the end. But Dante certification from Audinate. You don't need two of me. Dante certification from Audinate really does a great job of, frankly, explaining these things more technically. I'm literally just doing an overview, and this is the way I like to look at them because it suits my brain. I don't have the kind of thought process in my mind that works really well on a super technical lots and lots of alphabet soup, letters and numbers and whatever. To me, it's just, if I understand it as, it's neighborhoods, and these have to be the same, and these have to be different, and this is what DHCP is, and when I see 169.254, I know what's going on, and these are things that from a practical standpoint, when I'm sitting on a show site, and I just had 4 days straight of Dante hell trying to get the Dante network to work correctly, and ultimately, these things that I just said were the things that I needed to understand in order to basically figure out how to make all the stuff work. That and the concept that having things set up in the shop before they show up at the show is a super great thing. All right. I've rambled on and I've already burned 25 minutes and we haven't even done anything fun. So let's start with an iPad, because that might be cool. So first things first, let's take a look at the console and let's talk about how you set up the basic networking stuff in the console, where it is, how it works, get a basic idea of that. I can already tell this class is going to go late. So I'm going to start here. What is this? Oh, let's do that. All right. Just getting out of that. So step one, all the networking stuff that you need to care about is in setup. So setup, and then the network button. Now there's two different network tabs here, and the one for mixer control is the one that controls mixer control. So that wasn't too hard to figure out. This is where you set the IP address for the console so that you can then attach external things like iPads and CL editors. One of the things to know about the Yamaha consoles is they will not operate in auto IP or DHCP mode for console control. It has to be a static IP. That doesn't mean that everything in your network has to be static IP. You can still use a DHCP server, but you have to set a static IP in the console, and then if you're using a DHCP server, it's very handy to then go into that server and say, don't use this address that I'm using for my console. Now, one of the tricks that I do is I often will set the IP address in the console to a relatively high number, because most DHCP servers are set, most IT people set DHCP servers to assign addresses in lower numbers and stop at 100 or stop at 200 or whatever. So typically, if you go for a higher number, your chances of just being lucky and not having a conflict go up. So you'll see that the address that I've chosen here is 192.168.1, which is what my local network is in my house, is the one range. And I've set it to 222. The 192.168 is another thing that comes up very often. I'm going to give 15 seconds on it, and that is just for reasons that I completely don't understand. It's the kind of default first two subset things that are like most things default to 192.168. Most routers default to 192.168. Yamaha's manual even says you should, default to 192.168. Now, the default for Yamaha is 192.168.0, and then whatever you want. My local network is set to 1, so consequently, I've got my console set to 1. You'll see the subnet mask, just as I talked about, 255.255.255.0, and that way, every single thing in my network that's talking to other things, all is in that one subnet. Your gateway address, I'm not a network guy. 99.999% of the times, if you have to set a gateway address, the first three numbers if you're in 255, or the first two numbers, let me slow down. The first three numbers if you're in a 255.255.255 subnet mask, or the first two numbers if you're just in the first 255s, need to match what IP addresses that you're using. The other two can be 1. And essentially, that's the gateway. That's essentially, the best analogy is that thing I was talking about of the distribution center for the mail. You know, if you've got it set to 192.168.1, then we already know that all of this stuff is in Savannah, and the gateway is the distribution center in Savannah that sends out little trucks just into Savannah, Georgia to deliver the packages. I don't need to hit apply because this is already set. Very, very important. There is a little message that will come up and tell you this, but every single time you change the network address on a Yamaha CL or a QL console, you have to reboot the console. Hardware, reboot it, turn it off, turn it back on again, or it won't take. That's a thing that bit me 100 different times. So there you go. Now, there's another tab on here for device control. I'm just going to cut to the chase for device control and say most of us in the current situation that we're in as far as current gear will not be using that. Device control is typically for different head amp mic pre's and things like that. It does have to be in a different range than the console, etc., etc. Excuse me. I basically never use it out there in the real world. There are certainly reasons. It's a sort of a legacy thing for legacy devices. We'll talk briefly in a little bit about Yamaha's support of various wireless receivers and the ability to put that information from those wireless receivers into the console. I don't have a wireless receiver here to show you that, but the short version is that the control information for that rides down the Dante network and arrives at the console via the Dante network, which is a whole different bailiwick and has nothing to do with device control in here whatsoever. That's a really easy confusion point to have. Excuse me. So that is one of the few. Jeff Francis says 192.168 is one of the few network numbers reserved for local use. Yes, absolutely. And I'm now remembering that now that he said that. We have to remember that IP addresses are used for over the internet for like all things. Like again, when you get into the the first set of numbers, you're talking about the entire world's worth of IP addresses. So nothing that's an external IP address on the internet can be a 192.168 number because those are reserved for local use. What I don't really understand, Jeff, is why they picked that set of, couldn't they have made it I don't know, 2020 or something easy to remember? Why 192.168? That just feels like random numbers. It's like the 169.254 thing. I don't why? That just feels like two random numbers to me. I'm sure it isn't. I'm sure there's binary reasons or tech reasons or good reasons, but I'm just an idiot sound guy and it doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so let's connect an iPad. That'll be fun. So I have this brilliant display idea of how to display my iPad, which is to put it right here. So there you go. Now we have an iPad. I'm going to pop into here. StageMix is Yamaha's iPad control app. It's free. You can get it on Android. You can get it on iOS. I only use Apple devices, so here you go. Excuse me. I need to talk softer. So when you open up StageMix, this is the first thing that you'll get, and this is where you just have to add the mixer that you want to connect to. It does remember a bunch of mixers, so if you work with a bunch of different companies and they have a bunch of different networks and a bunch of you can remember. So the ones that are in here currently are ones from other shows that I've done. I'm going to go ahead and add our local mixer here. So add a mixer. I'm going to call it, I don't know, you, me. I can't find the plus button. And CL3. That's cute. Okay. And then you have to put in the IP address. You'll see that it defaults to 192.168.0.128. That is Yamaha's default number. That's not the number of my console, which means it's not going to connect. My console is 1222. before I hit the magic connect and make it go, I am going to go back and mention, I probably should have mentioned this a while ago, before I got into it, that the console Ethernet control connector, which is not the same as the Dante connector on the back, you'll see that it's a different network connector, just needs to be attached to a network with Wi-Fi attached to it, a router attached to it, so that your Wi-Fi and your LAN are on the same network. There's about 150,000 ways that can be configured wrong, depending on what gear you're using and how it's configured. I'm not even going to really dig that deep into it. Just suffice to say that so long as your Wi-Fi network and your local wired network can see each other, then this will work fine. Now, it's important that your local network, you know what subnet is on, because that's how you're going to connect to the console. I know that mine's 192.168.1. So you do need to select which console you have. I have a CL3, so that's me. And I'm going to add that mixer. And then I'm just going to connect. And voila, just like that, I have a console connected to StageMix. So, and you can see that I can, oh, what am I doing? Yep. Look, remote control. It's like freaking magic. Obviously, this is extremely useful for doing things like I want to walk out in front of the PA and test things and whatever. I'm not going to do a walkthrough of the StageMix app. There's lots and lots of online tutorials for that. Lots and lots of ways to leverage that. Someone's going to know. Oh, Scott said that the StageMix to control the console itself is only on iOS. Well, that sucks. I was not aware of that. The Monitor Stage app is available on Android, though. Interesting. I did not know that. I will say, if you're not an Apple person, StageMix runs on literally the oldest, junkiest iPad you can find. I actually have 2 or 3, don't have them handy, like iPad Mini 2s that you could probably get on eBay right now for $30 that will run StageMix in their sleep. And I have 2 or 3 like old junky iPads like that I literally bought on eBay for like $30 that I use for things like StageMix, or I use them for Unity Intercom, or I use them for several other things that they run just fine on. And so that's a little hack if you aren't an Apple person. I realize that having to buy something in addition to your fleet of devices is a pain, but you know, what can I tell you? So that's how you join up StageMix. The cool thing is that it does sync immediately. So there's no weird syncing thing that you have to like sync the two things together. It just pops right up and it works. So that's that. It's very handy. It's very cool. Now I'm going to spend a second. Man, we're running out of time already. I'm going to spend a second real quick on how to attach the editor. And then I'll talk a little bit about the editor, and then we will move on to remotely possible. So, what's the best way for me to do this? I think I'm going to do it this way. Let's share a screen. I'm going to try to share a screen, and we'll see if I get lucky. Well, let me open this up first. All right. So, hopefully, everyone can see. Well, you're looking at, what are you looking at? My desktop? I was trying to, and it's the wrong desktop. Not helpful. Let me try again. I thought I was sharing just this guy. Actually, is that going to be confusing? Probably. I'll just see if I can share just the editor. Okay, let's try this. Okay, there's the editor. Does it show you? Yes, and it shows you this bits. Okay, although it's not gonna, let me see. Sorry, I should have tried this ahead of time. Okay, it does show you that stuff. Okay, cool. So it's showing you all the bits and bobs. All right, so the first step to getting the editor connected is you open up the editor. The editor is a little bit of a pain in that the CL and the QL editors are different, even though the show files are compatible with each other. And it is very important that you have the editor that matches the firmware that's in your console. So if you download the editor and you try to connect it and it says wrong version or whatever, check your firmware in your console and then go back to the Yamaha site and find the editor specifically for the firmware that's in your console. So it's relatively easy to connect this. The top of the screen that you can't see because of the way that I'm sharing is the file drop down in system setup. Once you bring up system setup, you just type in the address for the console. I happen to have already pre-done this. Select which console you want. The synchronization, automatically synchronize on file load. You can decide or not. This level meter, I always enable it. You don't have to. It increases the amount of data going back and forth because it's basically sending all the meter data back to the editor all the time, but I like that. And window control from console is a cool thing that, again, a whole nother class, but where you can select things on the console and it automatically brings up the window that you need. So you do that, and poof, lo and behold, we are online. Now, I happen to have already synced this console ahead of time, but let's pretend that I did not. The first thing that you want to do is you go again to the top of the screen that you can't see, and it'll say resynchronize. And then this is a little easy tip, a little extra tip for you. No matter how many times you've used the editor, no matter how many times you do this, every single time you bring up this window and you go to choose console to PC or PC to console, think to yourself, which way do I want to synchronize this? Which has the thing that I actually want and which am I trying to load to? Because if you do this backwards and you haven't saved something, you can lose your whole show. Ask me how I know. So I've done this probably 1,000 times, and every single time I bring up this window, I go, what am I doing? Console to PC. Yes, I have the stuff in my console. I want to load it to the PC. Yes, that's what I want to do. And then I hit OK. The synchronization process takes longer than it should. I'm not going to lie. It really feels like it should go faster. But on a local area network, it takes, I don't know, 20 seconds or something. I know that there are other consoles that take quite a bit longer to synchronize than this. So, yeah, it's not too bad. And to be clear, this literally synchronizes everything on the console. All the stuff, all the patching, all the UDKs, all the scenes, all the everything. And so then everything that's in your console has now been put into the editor, and the editor now has access to all of it. I didn't time this, but we're getting close to the end and almost there. The other thing to note is that the file that's in the editor is identical to the file that you store on a thumb drive. They are interchangeable. So if I go and I hit save as, and I save this file as whatever I want to save it and put it anywhere I want on my computer, if I take that and I stick it on a thumb drive, I can then go to another console somewhere else, put that thumb drive in the console, load that thumb drive in, and it will just load that exact show into the console. And as I've mentioned before, the show files for CLs and QLs are completely compatible with each other. So you can create, I've done this, in fact, I just did this less than a week ago. I created a show file for somebody on my CL3 that he was going to use on a QL1. And as long as I just kept myself limited in the buses that I was selecting and basically I kept myself within the parameters of what I know is on a QL1, I then sent him the show file. He showed up on the show, put the thumb drive in his desk and hit load, and away he went. So that's how you connect the editor. All right. So yeah, Scott makes a good point. A couple of good points. I'm not going to spend really any more time on the editor. There's a manual for it. You can Google it. You can read all about it. One of the things that's a bit of a throwback and a bit of an annoyance. I know if Kevin Kimmel was on here, he'd tell us the reasons for it. I'm sure it had to do with organizational reasons and development reasons that are way, way, way above my pay grade. But there are things on the console that aren't on the editor. There are things you cannot do from the editor on the. And I guess I didn't really show, but once you're synchronized, the remote control works exactly the same as it did with StageMix. Everything is. Did I? Yeah. I'll just, for the sake of the magic. Well, I guess can I show both? Yeah, I can show both at the same time. I'll just do that. So yeah, so you can see that, when I move something on the editor, it moves the console, and when I move the console, it moves the editor. So that when things are in sync and lined up, everything that you do on one does the other and vice versa. But as I was saying, there are things on the console that don't appear on the editor anywhere. Among them, and probably most importantly to me, the oscillator controls, the monitor controls are not on the editor. It's a source of much contention and annoyance for me. But it is what it is. Like I said, I think it's just a throwback to the way that they were developed. It's interesting to me that the editor and the console user interface don't look anything alike. I have to believe that they were developed by two completely different teams in Yamaha at the same time and then just bridged together for control. Real quick name drop. I just came off of a Ravage console. Who knows, there may soon be a Yumi and a PM3 show series. Well, we'll see, because I was suitably impressed. I'll say that. And the most impressive thing to me, well, no, that's not true, but very impressive thing to me is that the user interface for the console and the user interface for the editor match. They're now the same. And in fact, if you're interested in even previewing, even getting ahead of the curve on how to use a Ravage, you're interested in I want to be able to use one when I see one, or, if you work someplace where they may be looking, if you download the editor and basically work your way through the editor, it's the same look and feel as actually working the console, just without a lot more of the physical controls. We're getting a little low on time. So yeah, Jeff, thank you for that. He said, what is your Mac IP address subnet on, and what about on the iPad? Yeah, so the subnet for my local area network is 192.168.1. The subnet for my iPad for my Wi-Fi is 192.168.54, if I remember correctly. I have a router in between the two that is routing my Wi-Fi to my local area network. Again, a completely different class as far as how to work with IP routers and how to attach different subnets together. One, I barely know what I'm doing, and two, it's extraordinarily complicated. But just suffice to say that my router is bridging those two things together. I have a mesh network Wi-Fi system in my house that is then bridged together with my local area wired network so that the two subnets talk to each other. Do we have any other questions? And if not, then I'm just going to kind of show you something cool before we're done. Monitor stage, what is your, how about iPad? Didn't look like, yeah. Now, that was a good catch though, Jeff. I'm impressed because I didn't really show a whole lot of that iPad. And he caught like, wait a minute, how's that talking? That shouldn't be talking. Nothing. Okay. So I'm going to just do something kind of cool. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a camera on the mixing console on the other side. And that's unfortunate, but you're just going to have to trust me. I'm going to clean up my window here a little bit so I can show you my whole screen. Let me just get rid of you. And I'm going to get rid of you. And I'm going to move you out of the way. All right. So here we go. And I'll make you smaller. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. This time I am going to share the whole desktop so we can see the whole thing. So obviously it's really cool to control your console from a computer, control your console from an iPad. The one thing I'll just do a real quick mention. Only one instance of the editor can be attached to the console at the time, but multiple instances of StageMix can be attached to the console at the same time, and the StageMix and the editor can be attached to the console at the same time. So the only real limitation is you can only attach one instance of the editor to the console at one time, which turns out, with what I'm getting ready to show you, to be kind of a pain in the butt. But anyway, so I'm showing you my screen. I am going to go ahead and take the editor offline, and I'm going to show you this little widget that's called Remotely Possible. This is developed by a friend of mine named Andy Broughton. I had the idea. He did absolutely all the work, so I want to make sure that he gets the proper credit for it. But the idea was, I knew that you could control across Yamaha and QL consoles, that you could basically control them, mirror them essentially by just attaching a couple of MIDI cables between the two, and you can literally mirror two consoles together to use one as a backup or to expand things or whatever. It's been a feature in Yamaha consoles since I don't even know, probably the 01, certainly the 01 V96 and probably before that. And it still carries through to today. And I was like, well, you know, can we put the internet in between there instead of MIDI cables? That was my crazy idea. Andy Broughton did it. So again, credit to him. So he created this little thing called Remotely Possible. And so what this allows me to do is attach my local console over the internet to another console in a completely different location anywhere in the world. So I've kind of already preset this up. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time walking through the software. That's a whole nother, 3 or 4 hour class. But suffice to say that I can connect, and now I'm connected to my local console here in Savannah, and through a VPN, and I'm using a hardware VPN, but there's a lot of different ways to do the VPN that works. I'm now going to hit connect, and I'm now connected to a QL1 that's located in San Francisco, California. And the last step of this, that is the cool bit, is I can then connect an editor, which I'm going to do, and I connect the editor locally to my local computer. The universal local connection for anything, if you want to connect something via a network to your local computer, is 127001. That's a handy little trick to know. Same deal, QL3, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, there's a bit of a cumbersome process to sync these two consoles together because, for complicated reasons, I typically will take a show file. So what you're seeing right now is not the actual content of the remote console, but you can see because of these arrows right here that the remote console is connected to my local instance of QL Editor. And that means that I can see locally what's happening on that remote console. And in fact, these meters right here are a playback machine that's in use in California plugged into that remote console. And you'll see that, wait for it, I'll give you an overhead shot. When I, turn on the connection. When I move a fader, you can see that the editor moves in response. So to be clear of exactly what it is that we're doing, I'm pushing a fader on my console. It's moving a fader in California on a QL1. The QL1 is synced up to the CL or the instance of editor here, and that instance of editor is then moving in response to the remote console. So when I see that fader move here, I can be 100% certain that the console on the other end has actually responded to what I'm doing, because the only way for the editor to move is for the remote console to have sent the message to it. So that's sort of the super advanced class of remote controlling. And with that, like I said, it's a whole nother huge class to get into the workflow of how to really leverage that. But I just kind of wanted to give a quick little kind of tease of that. But I actually do shows with this company in California where they've got it's a studio, and they've got a bunch of things plugged into a QL1 locally in the studio, and I mix them using my CL3 as a remote control to their console, using basically the same networking that you would use locally with a local console. The big difference is because I'm going console to console, literally everything I do on my console mirrors on that console, including if I turn up and down the lamps on the console, store things, change the screen resolution, like absolutely every possible thing I can do on my console gets mirrored on the remote console. The only exceptions are things like my specific fader layers are different because my console has different fader layers. The QL1 just ignores that. It doesn't really care where my custom fader layers end up, because channel 1 is still pushing channel 1 and it's still responding to channel 1. So that's a little teaser of Remotely Possible, which is something that is available, and feel free to send us a note. You can send a note through Scott at theproductionacademy.com. It'll get to me. If there's enough interest, I'll do a whole class on Remotely Possible and really show you the entire workflow, how I listen to the signals, how ridiculously low the latency is, because it's ridiculously low and completely, totally within the realm of doing a show. In fact, the latency, my monitoring latency is coming back. Actually, the round trip latency of the control signal going from Georgia to California, which for those of you who aren't from the US is literally across the entire country. So it's, I don't know, 2,500 kilometers or something, long ways. The round trip from going from my side of the country to California, and then me hearing the audio change coming back, is less than if I was 70 feet away from a front of house stage and I pushed a fader and it took that long for the audio to get to me, because audio goes through air slowly. So it's, if you can mix front of house at a concert 70 feet from the stage, you can mix off of this method. Jeff Francis says +1 for Remotely Possible class. So yep, a couple other folks. So do you ever remote mix a live stream while a local mixer mixes in-house PA? On the same local console. Jeff, we haven't done it yet, but the feature set is built in to do it. And it is absolutely possible for me and a local engineer to be running the same console at the same time. In fact, one of the features built into Remotely Possible is the ability to split the console and have an entire section of the console that I can't control and a set of the console that I can control. You can set the consoles into QA and QB mode. Again, this is a whole class, so I'll put it in the hopper because I think that it will be a fun thing to play with. But if you put the console in QA QB mode, dual queue mode, then the local engineer can queue from their console what they want, and I can queue my part of the console, and the buses will be independent of each other and we won't step on each other, and yet we're still mixing off the same console. So yeah, it's absolutely possible. It can be done. Andy and I have actually demoed it and it works absolutely great. I haven't actually done it in a show yet, but the time will happen. It's already 5 after, or we've run a little bit over, but hopefully this has been helpful, and some of the things that have maybe tripped you up in trying to do remote controls of your console were explained in a way that hopefully made sense. It's the end of the class. I always open it up for one last popcorn question. You can ask me anything you want. Scott asked me that question last time and he didn't get it in time. So he's been waiting. So his question, perfectly valid question. Why did you get a CL3 instead of a CL5? So, funny story, Scott. I had a CL5. Actually, for a while I had 2 CL5s. Don't ask me. It was weird, but there you go. Actually, I will tell the story because it's kind of funny. The pandemic started, and I get this crazy idea of, hey, I wonder if you could remote control Yamaha consoles one from another. And I talked to my friend Andy Broughton, and he's like, I don't know. Let's see if we could do it. And I thought, well, man, it would be great if I had a console so we could test that out and see how it would work. So then I called 2 of my friends in the DC metro area who weren't doing much because there was a pandemic, both of whom owned CL5s, hoping one of them would let me borrow one. They both said yes. So at that point, I was like, embarrassment of riches. Okay. So I drove up from Savannah, Georgia up to DC, and I picked up 2 CL5s, and I brought them back to my 1,500 square foot house in Savannah, Georgia, and I plopped them down in my bedroom like a crazy person. And I had 2 CL5s, and then I did an event in California for 4 months. At the end of the year, the pandemic started. Apparently, there was a big thing happening in the U.S. that took about 4 months to do. That's all I'm allowed to say about that. But I used 2 CL5s in California for that, brought them back to my house, and I decided to buy the 1 CL5 because at that point I was committed. So I bought the CL5, but here's the bottom line. I have a small house. I can use any CL to remote control any QL. I can do a CL3 on this class as easily as I can do a CL5. And so I had a friend who had picked up a CL3 in a purchase with a bunch of other things that they wanted, and they didn't really want the CL3. They wanted a CL5. So you see where this goes. So I traded my CL3 for a CL5. But the bottom line is I mostly did the CL3 because it's smaller. In my particular environment, I don't miss the extra 8 faders. Most of the remotes that I'm doing, I'm controlling QL5s or QL1s. So this has enough faders. It has enough real estate. It does enough things. It's small enough. I actually hauled it out of my house, stuck it in the back of my car, and used it locally in a show about 2 months ago in the place of a QL1, which is what they were going to supply for me. And it was glorious because I had all of the CL options, but it's small enough that I could literally pick it up by myself and plop it into my car. So practical reasons is why the CL3, and frankly, I probably would be fine with the CL1. It's amazing, what you get used to, but I don't miss the extra faders. Now, that being said, I do a lot of bigger shows with CL5s where the extra fader real estate, because of channel count and bus count and everything else, becomes super, super critical. A show I just did on the Rivage, I used, that's a 38 fader console, and I used all of it and lots of custom fader layers to get through because I was 65 inputs and 72 outputs or something. So it was a lot of stuff.